The Battlehosts. Be a better gamer, build a better community.
Welcome to Battlehosts, a podcast, a website dedicated to helping you become a better 40K gamer and to build a better community of players. I'm your host, Mark, and with me tonight is Colin.
Hello.
So, if you like what you hear, subscribe to us on iTunes to catch all the latest episodes, and you can follow us on Facebook under The Battlehosts. If you'd like to support The Battlehosts for as little as $1 a month, you can visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/TheBattlehosts. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about the basics of miniature painting. So that's why I have Colin on again.
Happy to be here.
Now, we did a whole series of podcasts on the airbrush, demystifying the airbrush.
Yeah.
And that was both good and bad, because now people are really excited to use an airbrush. However, you know, there's still some basics of actually using a brush that we need to sort of talk about. And that's kind of what this episode is about, really. We're going to start from the very beginning about preparing and priming a little bit, talk about some of the tools, talk about paints and brushes, how to use a brush to get a smooth finish, and we'll cover a little bit of some more advanced stuff like wet blending and things like that.
Yeah.
This is basically just a companion episode to the airbrush segments, and so there's just some basic techniques that everyone kind of needs to know about. You know, the videos that GW puts out with Duncan are really good, but he doesn't really talk about the reasons why he does some of the things he does.
Right. They're a great resource.
Yeah.
They really are. But I think these are kind of the baseline that you build on with the airbrush.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way. I feel like a lot of people now feel like they have to airbrush to get to a certain level of painting or get a certain result. And you don't. You can do brilliant painting with just a brush.
Just a brush, yeah. And you can't airbrush everything. Like, there's only certain things you can airbrush anyways. Yeah. And the smaller the model, you know, maybe you airbrush a base coat, but that's about it. Yeah. It's really, really hard to... At some point, you're going to have to put a brush to a model.
If you want the more detail that you're going for in a model, the more brushwork you're going to have to do.
Yeah.
And for most things I paint, it's usually I'll airbrush the armor panels, and that's about it. You know, and then like object source lighting on a plasma gun or something. But that's about it. Everything else is done with a brush.
Yeah.
And there are, you know, a lot of reasons for that. So
that's what we're talking about today.
It's good to have a strong base of skills to draw from.
Yep. When I first started, I mean, so I painted, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, I had painted plastic models with enamel paints.
There you go.
Which is really horrible, right? It's a terrible, terrible way. You know, it's how, you know, the little metal caps and everyone kind of got, that's how a lot of us got started back in the day. But when I got back into the hobby and I started, you know, realize, oh, there's these acrylic paints with GW paints and how much better things are, it really does make a difference. It's so much easier to paint with a brush now, and there's just so many great tools right now that they have.
Yeah, I mean, and they keep developing new tools and new types of paint. And there's so much out there, though, that it can be overwhelming for somebody that wants to take the next step and get better. There's, you know, which way do you turn? And, you know, there are people that, well, I want to get better painting. Should I look at, you know, non-metallic metal? Yeah. And it's like, oh,
slow down.
You don't have to go that far.
Yeah.
You know, you could just work on, you know, getting a solid base and wash and highlight.
Yep.
Goes a really long way.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not, you know, full of shortcuts, and it's not, you know, it's still at the end of the day about brush control and preparation and knowing, you know, what you want to achieve, that you have that, like we said, that set of skills to draw on that will carry you through whatever application that you want to do.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Now, before we get into this episode, let's take a break, and we're going to hear a word from our sponsor, GGT. When we come back, we'll just jump right into our topic.
All right.
We all love Warhammer 40K, but sometimes games just take too long. Using a game timer is the best way to make sure games finish and for both players to get an equal amount of time. Check out the Easy Game Timer from DGT, manufacturers and designers of the timers officially sanctioned by the International Chess Federation. It's simple to set up and customize, and your settings are saved when it's turned off. It's easy to use with a large moving lever for changing turns and a clear digital readout. It's the most affordable and high-quality game timer on the market and is the choice of most 40K events. Whether you want to practice before a big event or you just want to be a better player, the Easy Game Timer from DGT is the perfect game timer for your 40K events. The DGT Easy Game Timer is available from many online retailers. Wholesale pricing is also available for tournament organizers. Check these fine clocks out at dgtnorthamerica.com. Speed up your game and improve your play with the Easy Game Timer from DGT.
All right, and we're back. So let's talk a little bit about let's start with the basics of miniature painting. Now, before you get started with any kind of painting, you need to prepare the model using basic construction techniques. And we actually have an episode about this. There's an episode on how to get your army tournament ready. And we also have another episode on conversions that you should check out. Basically, you want to clean up the mold lines of your model. Please. For the love of Pete, please clean your mold lines.
If you're not going to, and drill your barrels, but if you're not going to drill your barrels, at the very least, clean your mold lines.
And here's the thing. When you paint, those mold lines are only going to look worse, especially if you paint like a white or a light color. So painting does not cover up any surface blemishes. It just amplifies them.
Right.
So,
and I don't care how good an airbrush artist you are, if you're airbrushing a model that's full of mold lines and sprue cutoff, I mean, they're all going to show up.
Yep.
Constructing the model and cleaning it properly is just as important as any other stage. You're really setting yourself up for the rest of the project. There is nothing worse than getting through the base codes, start putting on highlights, and then you notice a mold line on an arm.
Yep.
And now you have to go back, scrape the mold line, reprime, repaint, and it just sets you back. So proper preparation is you put in some time on the front end, and it pays dividends. The whole project.
Yeah, I mean, and basically you get a decent sprue cutter, and Games Workshop actually sells decent ones. They're spendy, but they're not bad. But you can get a cheap one at like Lowe's. Yeah, the little cutters, the little nub cutter.
You can get little like the little wire cutters and stuff. I use, and GWs are spendy, but I've heard nothing but good things. I've heard they're really, really good cutters, and they're extremely durable.
Yeah.
I use a pair of Tamiya sprue cutters they're tiny. Like the head on the clippers is really small, and I think they were $15 or $16, I think.
That's not bad.
Which is pretty cheap. GWs are like $30.
Yeah.
But you can find them for $5 at a hardware store too.
For sure.
I really like the Tamiya ones that I use that a buddy of mine turned me on to, but as long as they're sharp, I feel like I'm the spendy portion of the podcast, but this is one of those things that will be used on every single model that you buy.
Yep.
So that extra few dollars
you're getting work out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
It'll save you time. So what you don't want is a dull set of clippers that when you go to cut the sprue will tear the bottom of the sprue out of the plastic. Yeah. Versus just cutting it. Yeah. Because then you're going to end up with a divot in your model, and then that creates problems down the line as well.
Or you'll leave too much of a nub on, and then you got to clean that up, and then it's easy, especially with a knife, to dig too deep, which I've done. Yep. We all kind of have, and
I still do.
You want to, you want to make it cut as close as possible, so you don't have that much stuff to clean on the attachments. And you can tell the new plastic models are so much better because they put those attachment points in better spots.
Yes.
And the mold lines are in better spots. Versus like, I don't know, the old classic Elder Guardian head where the mold line is literally right down the middle of his head. It's terrible. It's terrible.
But they still have their like the, Skitarii robes. There's a seam right down the side on each side of the body, which is awful. Yeah. There's just no way to hide it. Yeah. It's unfortunate, but then you start talking about putty and all this stuff, and you're like, this is a 7-point infantry model. How much modeling work do I really want to do? But in general, but then I put it together. I forget what kit it was, Changeling maybe. But all the mold lines are hidden behind seams when you're building the model, and it was just like, this is brilliant. Yeah. So the models are making it easier. They're getting much better.
But there's still some like that, like the Skitarii robes, where you're attaching two pieces of robe together. Right. Which is really hard to, you put them together and hopefully that the glue perhaps will eliminate the seam, but oftentimes you've got to clean that up a little bit.
And one of the things that really helps is if you can go to the hardware store and get like 1,000 grit wet dry sandpaper and even up to like 1,500 grit I found at like Home Depot.
Yep.
And this is so fine that it doesn't scratch this plastic and leave like grooves in the plastic. It just smooths it out. It's almost like a polish, like a stone
buffer almost.
Or something like that. And it really just buffs it.
Yeah.
And it's great for those times you dig a little deep or you know, you're scraping the mold line and you're pushing a little too hard and you kind of flatten it out.
Yeah.
Getting some of that really fine sandpaper and just giving it a little rub is great.
Just changes the contours a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, so those are, I mean, the construction pieces, I think, in building your models, you want to use good sprue cutters, and I think the Tamiya sounds good. The GW is good. I'm going to go over the Tamiya, but you can get them cheap. But the problem is they get dull over time, so you make sure you're not using dull ones. Mold line removers, they have mold line removing tools, but I usually use just the edge of an X-Acto knife, but you could kind of go either way.
Yeah, I have the mold removal tool. It's thick.
Yeah.
The metal is thick, which makes it a little awkward to use.
Yeah. Versus a knife that you can always kind of get the little tip in there to clean. Yeah.
I flip the blade, the X-Acto blade over. I use the back of the X-Acto
The back of it, that's better.
Rather than the front.
Because you could easily dig in a chunk.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And you're dulling the blade. Good
point. When you're cleaning mold lines, it's really easy to get sloppy and dig into the plastic, which you just spent a ton of money on to make look nice.
Let alone resin. Like if you're pushing too hard on resin, you can just snap.
It's just gone.
It just snaps up. So, you know, there's a whole suite of PDFs and YouTube about cleaning resin models.
Yeah.
Which is a whole nother.
In fact, I think Games Workshop has an entire thing about how to work with resin, and Duncan talks about it, and he does a Sakaran, and he talks about how to clean it up, and actually that is a fantastic video, because resin can be a bit of, especially
it's tough.
It's harder. It's harder to work with.
It is, and it has different challenges than plastic.
Yeah. For sure. Now, let's talk about the idea of approaching the model. Now, this is all the building it is one thing, and the way if you watch all the Duncan videos, essentially he builds them completely and then we'll start painting. But there is such a thing as building the subassemblies. And the subassemblies really just depends on kind of what your approach to painting the model is. So I built, let's say, the Cataphren breachers. And those Cataphren models, if I had just built them all and just glued them, slapped them all together, there's no way I'd be able to paint half the stuff that's on there. There is so much fiddly things behind other elements.
Right.
So
when I painted my Cataphren breachers, I did assemble them, and it was a nightmare.
Yeah,
and it probably took twice as long to paint them.
I left the arms off. I left the plates on the sides off. I left the body off the track. I broke it as much as now. The reason I did this, the reason you paint in subassemblies is basically because you want to make it easier on yourself when you paint them.
Right.
There are elements inside a model that are going to be really tight. That it's really hard to get in with a brush. And I think the classic, what a lot of people struggle with Space Marines, I always have, is the Aquila on the chest.
Right.
Because they have the bolter that covers it. Oftentimes, it's really hard to kind of get in there. So sometimes people will leave the arms off. I kind of just put the arms on because I like to have it positioned in a certain way.
Yes.
It's kind of just the way you want to do it.
So in that specific, a lot of sub-assemblies will be dictated by your paint scheme.
Yeah.
So if your paint, like I painted a bunch of like Tau Fire Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they all had yellow helmets.
Yeah.
On gray bodies.
Yeah.
I'm not going to mask paint all the heads yellow and then mask them all and then paint the bodies gray.
Yeah.
I'm just going to paint the heads separately.
Yeah.
So that way there's no overspray, there's no masking, there's nothing. Same with like Eldar Guardians. If you're doing a red body, or like Samahan, if you're doing a red body and a white helmet, just paint the helmet separately.
Yeah.
But with things like you mentioned, like a Space Marine bolter or something, it makes it harder to get behind the bolter to get to the Aquila on the chest.
Yeah.
But there are two reasons I don't care about the Aquila on the chest as much. One, you're not going to see it.
Yeah.
Two, or I guess there's three reasons. Two is that is going to be, if the bolter is so close to the chest that I can't get a paintbrush in there to paint the Aquila, that's going to be cast in a heavy shadow if you're looking at the model. Like light-wise. So it's not going to be super reflective. It's not going to have all these highlights on it where the light is catching it.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it's behind the bolter.
It would be naturally dark anyways.
So it would be naturally darkened. So maybe if I can get a base coat down there, I'll
slap
be happy.
A little bit of silver or whatever.
And then I'll highlight the parts that you can see.
Yeah.
And maybe try and get a little below that. But I'm not worried about highlighting the feet on the Aquila that you'll literally never see.
Yeah.
But it's also, it doesn't unnaturally draw the eye because it is in shadow on the model. There are some painting reasons not to do that as well. The other thing is I paint the bolter case. The bolter casing is like probably one of the last things I paint on Space Marine.
Yeah.
Because it's the furthest from the body.
Yeah.
So, and most of the time I paint the bolter casings black.
Yeah.
So if I have to angle a brush and like rest it on the bolter casing to pull up to leave paint on the Aquila, that's fine. The bolter casing, it's going to eventually be black anyways. Yeah. So I'm just going to paint it black later.
Yeah.
So there's things like that. And that's kind of a more advanced technique, which is where you it's like playing out a turn in the game before the turn happens.
Yeah.
So if you're kind of visualizing, okay, I'm going to paint this, then I'm going to paint this, then this, and this, and this, you can kind of lay out areas for you to be less fine or more sloppy or where you can make mistakes because they're not going to be painted until later. So you can kind of plan for that as well. And that saves you the pain of having, if you're painting a 10-man squad, you have 20 arms, 20 Space Marine arms lying around that you have to keep track of.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah. And it's when you paint in sub-assemblies, when you have to glue them together, when you're gluing paint on paint, you cannot use plastic glue.
Right.
You have to use super glue.
Right.
And the way the bolters sit, and in my experience anyways, Primaris might be a little bit better, but the arms have to be kind of carefully positioned and you don't have a lot of like leeway there. And if you make a mistake, or maybe you have a little blob of glue or whatever, you can clean it up before you paint it. But if they're already painted,
you better hope you don't put too much glue on the
You better do it right. So,
Primaris are better because they have like almost square pegs.
Oh, that's
for
probably
the arms. So the wrist on the hand that's holding the gun,
not that awkward weird they used to have.
The cupped hand that like moves up and down. Yeah. But no, exactly. And I always worry about and I do paint. I paint plenty of stuff in sub-assemblies. Most commonly will be like, especially again with Space Marines, because Space Marines, but like the helmets and the shoulder pads. So like if the shoulder pads are a different color, than the armor, which on most Space Marine chapters they are.
It usually is, yeah.
Then I'll paint those separately.
Yeah,
it just makes life easier.
Yeah,
but when you're gluing, so like if you're using super glue, especially super glue reacts to the oils in your skin. And can fog where you've touched, like if your hands are sweaty or oily or something, and you glue a shoulder pad on there, and then there's that little drop of super glue that was on your thumb that you didn't know was there, and then you touch the shoulder pad and it rips the paint off. And so there are hazards involved in painting sub-assemblies. Yeah. And from a paint perspective, if you're painting, at a level where you know where you want your shadows and where you want your highlights, and there's that all has to flow over the model. So while these arms and shoulder pads and everything are on corks, that the lighting that you paint on those arms has to correspond to the lighting that you paint on the model. So if a guy's shoulder pad is straight up and down, is perpendicular to the ground, that casts a different shadow than if his arm is raised and the shoulder pad is horizontal to the ground.
Yep.
So, and if you do it wrong, it's going to look weird.
Yeah.
So
it's.
So it doesn't necessarily. But it's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of ways that sub-assemblies save you time.
Yep.
There are a lot of ways that sub-assemblies can cost you time.
Yeah.
As well.
For sure.
And just the headache of keeping track of all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when I painted the Skitarii Rangers, you said, leave the backpacks off. I'm like, that's perfect. Because they're spindly and they're fine. But I won't have to worry about them looking. They're literally a separate component that can look different from the rest of the body. And I just plug in there and it's fine. And they're metal.
And you can just airbrush the cloak and you're fine. And glue the backpack on and have a nice day.
That's how you do it.
So you want to be smart. I have a friend that loves sub-assemblies. And, the guy sits down to paint and there's 100 different parts of the model on cork in front of him.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, shoot me. There's no way.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Is you when you make a sub-assembly choice, you're making a certain choice and you have to have a reason for it, not just for the heck of it. And you're doing it because you want to get something painted. It's easier to paint it separate than when it's on the model. but there's all those hazards involved. You've got to make that choice. And one of the things we'll talk about this now, planning out the steps of painting is going from the inside out.
Yes.
When you're painting a model. So tell me a little bit about that. How would you we'll go back to the Space Marine, because the Space Marine is just it's just this the standard. So how would you
most people have painted a Space Marine or will paint a Space Marine at some point
in their lives. Yep.
So this is pretty much how I approach any model that I'm painting, regardless of race or composition. It's pretty common, I think, but it's painting from the inside of the model out. So what that means is painting the components of the model that are the deepest set, kind of furthest away from the surface of the model, if that makes sense. So on a Space Marine, let's say you base coated
his
Space
armor.
Marine, and he's, let's say, blue for Ultramarines.
Sure.
The next part that I'll paint will be like, the inset,
the little rubberized area.
Joints.
Yep.
From there, I'll go to like the next step out, which is kind of the hoses and stuff in the body, and maybe the Aquila, maybe on the chest. So what you're doing by doing this is, like I talked about with the Aquila, if you're painting the Aquila and you get paint on the bolt gun, that doesn't really matter because you're going to be painting the bolt gun later. Yeah. So you don't have to go back and touch anything up. Yeah. So
it's removing as many touch-up spots as possible.
Exactly.
Because you could go crazy going back and forth, touching this up,
and a lot of people do. Yeah. And because the order of operations is out of whack. Yeah. So I paint a lot of models. I paint a lot of models. And one of the ways I try to save myself time is by not having to do touch-ups. Because if I'm painting, like take these Space Wolves that I'm working on, if I paint the fur pelt, I paint all the fur pelts on the model. And then I paint the string, and then I paint the token, and then I paint the gem on top of the token. Yeah. I'm not trying to paint around the gem. Yeah. Right? Where then if I mess up, I'll have to go repaint the gem. Yeah. So if by working your way up, there are fewer opportunities for you to hit something with paint. Yeah. Because you're working further away from what you've already painted.
You're working in and out. Yeah. So like the gem is the last thing that goes on top of the silver thing. But if you painted the gem first, then had to paint the silver bits around it, then you would probably splash paint on the gem and you have to go back over.
Even if you're really confident in your brush control, it's going to happen. Yep. Then you have to go back to, okay, well, what paints did I use for that? Now you're only painting that one instead of painting all of them at once, which is more efficient. Yeah. So when working on the models, especially, doing things like, okay, I'm going to paint the metallics. I'm going to wash, paint, and highlight the metallics, and then I'm going to paint what's around them because metallics are easy to touch up. They cover everything. Yeah. But if you make a mistake with metallics, it's harder to cover up the metallic than it is to fix the metallic itself. Yeah. So, like, take an example. So, painting bolters again, I base coat, wash, and dry brush the metallics before I even think about the bolter casing. Yeah. Because I can go back and paint the bolter casing solid color and cover all that up. Yeah. Rather than trying to highlight or dry brush around the already painted bolter casing. Yeah. So, and then I paint this, the
Aquila that goes on the casing.
Right, right after that. Then the little trinkets that are hanging off. So by painting the model on inside out, you really give yourself an opportunity to just paint something and be done with it. Yeah. And move on. Yeah. And another way that I do that is and there's one big caveat to that, which is things that are black. Black is kind of my default, like, tertiary color in almost any color scheme. Yeah. Because it is so easy to go back and touch up because it covers everything. Yeah. So you're like, hey, that's black. Okay, I'm going to paint everything but that thing. And then I'm going to go back and I'm just going to paint it black. Yep. And I'll be done with it. Yeah. So black is kind of my painting security blanket, I guess you'd say. Yeah. Where you're like, oh, wow, I'd really like if these bolter casings were yellow. Yeah. But there's just no way. But if I did, going back to our previous discussion, if I did want bolter casings to be yellow, I would paint them separately. Yeah. To protect them.
To protect them, because the yellow is it's
you're a brave man, because once you make a mistake on yellow, especially airbrushed yellow,
it's a real bear to go back and fix it. Yeah, for sure.
It's a long road.
Yeah, so that's the lighter the color, the more delicate it is, I guess, is a way to say it. And so you want to limit the amount of time or the amount of opportunities to splashing paint on that. Yes. So that's why painting outside or inside out is really the best way. So you're going from the most interior spots outside of that, and that's essentially
right. And then you're pretty much keeping your brush away from those things.
Yeah.
By painting stuff further away.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
You just don't. You're really minimizing the opportunity to get paint there, and you also you don't have to take as much time painting the interior stuff because if you do splash paint, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So you can move faster. You can be more not aggressive, I guess aggressive, but
yeah, but if you could slap things over, it's fine. Like you watch the GW videos, sometimes you'll see Duncan. I remember watching when he did one on Elrod, and it was one of the older ones where he went into great lengths, and he didn't break it into steps. He actually did, okay, I'm going to do the cloak, and I'm going to do the base coat, and then the two highlight colors. I think he was trying to show you the different colors and how you highlighted it up, but it was in a weird sequence. Right. So it really did lend itself to having a lot of like, oh, whoops, I messed up this other piece of it. So you really should just base coat everything first and then go back in and do the washes and the highlights. I mean, there's a reason why they say it's base coat, wash, highlight, right? Right. That you get the base coats all clean first, then you do washes, and then you do highlights in general. That's kind of the sequence of steps you want to go through. But it depends on the color, and that's where things get a little different. Right. For sure. And it depends. Yeah. And it depends on what, as with anything in painting, it depends on what you're painting. But I will usually finish off sections or colors before moving on to, like when I'm painting the rubber undersuit, I'll paint them all black. But then I'll go back and I'll highlight them. Oh, interesting. Before moving on. Oh, so you will do that. So then basically that way it's done.
It's done.
Done. That whole section is done.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And one of the reasons I do that is...
And you're doing this in batches too, because not a single... Yeah.
So if I'm doing a batch of 30 guys, I get into a rhythm and I remember where those elements are on the model. Oh. Because... inevitably, you're going to miss something.
Interesting. Okay.
And then you have to go back and paint it.
So Duncan's his Elrod thing actually does would work the way you might do it, where you're painting an element to its mostly to its conclusion, or a lot of elements
most of the way,
unless there's a wash that does all of it. But yeah.
Right. So if there are multiple things that I'm going to use Agrax on, for example, I'll base coat all those. Yeah. And then I'll go back and go Agrax. Yeah. And but if it's just something that I'm, base coat, wash, highlight, then I'll finish that. If it's like if I know that I'm not going to have to go back to it, I will just finish it.
Cool.
And I will move on.
That makes sense.
And then it's done. I don't have to worry about it. And you get that muscle memory, especially when doing kind of larger batches. You get that muscle memory for where those things are on the model, and you don't miss them. Yeah. Because it always happens, and it's always a little frustrating.
You miss a lens, or you miss a little thing here,
and then you're 6 components past that by the time you see it, and you're like, okay, now I have to stop what I'm doing now, because I'll forget. Yeah. So I'll have to stop what I'm doing now. Then I have to go back and base coat this, wait for it to dry, wash it, wait for it to dry, highlight it. Okay, now I can go back to what I was working on. Yeah. So that's one thing when batch painting, if I'm using a wash across a lot of different components or stuff. So it really depends on
the kind of the sequence of things,
where I can kind of be most efficient.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's talk about the brush. Now, the brush itself, the brush has 3 parts. Airbrush? It has no airbrush. Speaking of which, let's jump into that real quick. We did a bunch of series of demystifying the airbrush, and several people have asked for a single episode. So by the time you hear this, I will drop a bonus episode real quick that will have all of our all of our segments all basically stitched and edited together in one big massive episode. Oh, cool. So I'll do that so that we have this as a nice companion to this particular podcast. Yeah. So, so look for that soon. As soon after this, you hear this one here. So the brush itself, the actual brush, you have a handle, you have a ferrule, and you have a brush hair. And that's essentially what a paintbrush is. Yep. And the different materials for miniature brushes, sometimes you have synthetic, But mostly like the really, I don't know what GW uses. What's their material? They use a synthetic blend for their brush hairs?
They're natural.
Do they have is it Kolinsky Sable?
I don't think it's Kolinsky Sable. I think might be Weasel.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's some kind of.
But they use like fox / ferret / weasel / badger types of. There's natural, basically brushes, hairs from animals.
They are natural brushes. They're not Kolinsky Sable.
Yes, the most expensive and the most prized is the Kolinsky Red Sable, which I believe exists in Russia.
Western
I don't know
Russia,
where this little critter exists, but it is.
And it's becoming increasingly hard to source. And then there are like little ferret farms where they
literally have to grow these little guys because they're shave them for their hair or something. But
milk them.
I don't know how they do it, but anyway, so there's synthetic, there's natural, and then of the naturals, the most expensive is a Kolinsky Red Sable, but
because it holds its shape.
Yes.
So the thing about the Kolinsky Sable is that it can be shaped by hand into the heads of a paintbrush, and it has a good tension, which for more accurate brush strokes, and it has a full body, which will hold the belly of the brush, holds the paint.
Yep.
And it will, after you wash it and use it and wash it and use it, it really maintains that shape for a long time.
Yeah.
So that is the advantage. So while Kolinsky Sable is maybe more durable and more fine, and maybe more precise, you can get, badger, fox, whatever, ferret, weasel for some kind of small land mammal, fur, squirrel fur, I don't know. You can get them that have a really nice point. They have a good shape. They have a good belly, but they won't necessarily last as long as a Kolinsky Sable brush. Yeah. That being said, there's a big difference between natural brushes and synthetic brushes. Yeah, so
I think we could just safely say ignore synthetic brushes.
For the most part.
Yeah.
There are a couple very rare uses for synthetic brushes. They get the sharpest point possible because
it's synthetic.
It's plastic.
Yeah, it's plastic.
They don't hold paint well.
No.
But if you're doing like Jonas Wadeen, who is the freehand banner master of the universe, he'll use synthetic brushes when he needs to do super fine line work on a piece.
Because then it's literally almost like a point of a pen at that point. It doesn't hold a lot of paint.
And he does need to hold a lot of paint.
Yeah.
And he doesn't need it to last very long because they don't cost anything.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he'll use it for very limited applications. But for the most part, when you go to buy a brush, it's going to be a natural hair brush.
Yeah. And it's funny, when you first start, the brushes that... First of all, the size of the brushes are always measured in diameters. Now, Games Workshop just says they just small, medium, large, whatever. But for the most part, size 0, size 1, size 2, that's the diameter of the brush itself.
Right.
It's the point that kind of matters. And,
absolutely.
And it's you don't have to have a tiny single hair brush to get it.
Zero.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the point. And so you could have a huge fat brush that holds a ton of paint. If it can come to a tiny little point, then that's the point. That matters, right?
Yeah. And most people, so I paint with the equivalent of a size 1, basically, which is a GW's medium layer brush.
That's usually what the 1 is a nice, because I don't want to bounce back and forth, and 1's like just small enough that I can do a lot of detail stuff, but big enough that I can do some cover.
Yeah, you can turn that thing sideways and just whoop, you can really lay some paint down. But I have Winsor Newton Series 7 brushes. I've tried the Raphael 8404. Those are both Kolinsky Sable.
Yep.
Those brushes are $15, $20 a piece. They cost so much that they sit in my paint cup with the cap on, just sitting there, waiting for some special project to use them on.
They want you to use them, Colin. They're sitting there very, very alone.
Actually, my size 1, I get a great value out of GW brushes. They recently changed. Like a couple years ago, they switched their brushes.
I tried them in a long time.
Oh, really?
I gave them up years ago. But
when they switched, they were terrible.
Yeah.
So their old brushes used to be fantastic. The ones with a little colored nib at the end.
Oh, okay.
Those used to be fantastic. And then they changed them, and the initial run was terrible.
Yeah.
Now you have to kind of look through. They're a little hit and miss, but I'd say 95% of painting I do with a medium layer brush.
Interesting. Okay. Can you get the tip on them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you find a good one, So like every time I go to the GW store, I look through their medium layer brushes.
Oh, and you literally will go and try to find the one that has.
I will look through every single brush and to see one that has a good shape and has a good point.
Yep.
They don't want me licking their brushes anymore. But I'm kidding. I don't lick brushes that other people will take home. But but it's only an $8 brush.
Yeah.
So and they wear down.
Sure.
But then those I use for base coats or mixing.
Yeah,
as
it gets broader. It's sometimes like, so I have Kolinsky sable brushes, and I'm a bit of a nut when it comes to them because I love them, right? And I think it's because at the time I wasn't a very good painter, so I'm like, you know what, I'm going to have the best damn tools, and then I'll just work my way into them. I'll catch up to them. So I got Da Vinci. I have Winsor Newton. I have Raphael. And I recently got, it was another one that I got that was from a Kickstarter. They're Kolinsky Red Sables.
Right.
They're brilliant brushes. They're really, really good. And my skill's finally catching up to them. I think I could probably turn around and use an old brush and be just fine.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's that much better for me. I just think that I because I spent the money on them, I appreciated them.
Right.
I really do like the way they work. They're just, the tips are really nice. But sometimes if you're doing like, a large flat surface, having a thin tip is more kind of a detriment in some ways.
Right.
It's better to have kind of more of a broad. So I have GW brushes that have a little more of a blunter edge to just color block big things because I'm not going to sit there with a tiny tip brush and get it all in there. So
you're not dry brushing with Kolinsky sable.
No.
Let's be honest.
No. No, exactly.
So there are a lot of, and sometimes you do want more texture. I mean, I have brushes that are just like destroyed.
Yeah.
I mean, they're half the length that they used to be.
Yeah.
But if I'm painting leather and I want small lines or dots on the edge of, a leather strap or something, I can just put paint on that brush and just hit the strap a few times and, boom, I've got texture.
Yeah.
Versus using a super fine pointed brush and now I have to go put each little, which I'll do depending. But, the fact that GW brushes break down faster than Kolinsky sable isn't necessarily a detriment to me because A, they're only $8.
Yeah.
And B, I have uses for those brushes once they break down.
Yeah.
So do I get as much use out of 3 GW brushes that I would out of 1 red sable brush? So but then again, I do have my stash when I really need to get in and do some eyes and do some really fine work.
Yep.
I do have my stash of, size 0 sable brushes that are wonderful.
You have the tools. Yeah. So. Yeah. And it's the brushes really, you have to be comfortable with it. And I don't know, like I like the Kolinskys, but obviously it's GW as well.
As long as the paint doesn't get to the ferrule.
That's the thing. Yes.
Let the paint get to the ferrule.
So
that's
the paint, the paint should, and everyone does it. I do it. We all do it. But as much as you possibly can, the paint should be half or 2/3 up the brush at the most. Once it gets to the metal piece, the ferrule, the paint will dry in there, and then the brush hairs will kind of flay out.
Yeah.
That ruins brushes.
You're done at that point.
And if you see that, if you dunk it in there and you accidentally get too much in there, you probably should just stop, clean it while the paint's still wet, dry it off, clean it some more, and just if it dries in there, you're going to start ruining your brush.
Yeah. I really need to look up some brush care videos too, because I only use $8 GW brushes. Like I'm not sitting there at the end of each painting session with Master's brush soap, like working it and doing all this, and I like rinse them out and put them off to the side. And
well, you got things to do. But the thing is, you're painting in mass quantities too, and so that's the other thing. The Master's brush soap is the other thing you want to look at. It's basically like a big chunk of soap. Yeah, and if you think about it, like so natural brushes are hair. It's hair. It's an animal hair, but it's hair. And the Master's soap is like shampoo / conditioner in a brick that you sort of you wet your brush with, and you kind of rub it. You kind of twist it a little bit in the soap and get it all soapy and sudsy. Yeah. And then you clean out the paint, and it actually works really, really well. And
because one of the things that helps the brush keep its shape are the natural oils in the hair.
Yeah.
Are what help the brush. Yeah, you keep its shape and keep paint wicking out of the brush and keep it functioning. Mm-hmm. But the more you, like hair, the more you use it, the more you wash it and everything, it loses that oil. Yeah. And that's where it starts to break down. So the Master's brush soap helps to keep it healthy.
Yeah,
I
conditioned
guess,
as well.
Though, it's not growing anymore, obviously, but that would be a product.
Yeah,
tough to keep the weasel still though while you're painting. But I do use brush soap like with my Kolinsky brushes. I'll use brush soap. But
what you're saying is you got to the point where you can use a GW medium layer brush and get
long enough,
a long time, and you're fine. It's fine.
Because I don't use just that one. I have like 5 on my painting tray.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Or I have like 4 or 5 of these brushes all at various stages of decomposition.
Yeah.
So I'll have, so I'm not using the one that has the good point on it for a lot of general work.
Yeah.
I'm using that for the detail work. I'm using the other brushes for, maybe one is a step below that I use for edge highlighting.
Yeah.
And one's a step below that I use for color blocking.
Yeah.
One's a step below that. So I have, as they wear down, they just fill in a different role. It's like having 6 pairs of shoes instead of 1 pair of shoes.
Yeah. Right? You've got one for different occasions, basically.
And, so you're not putting all the wear and tear on 1 pair of shoes. You're putting it on, you're spreading it out. So it extends the life.
And you notice too that we're talking about GW being kind of not lower level, but kind of an entry level of quality.
They're like a mid-range.
They're a good mid-range brush.
Mid-range brush.
And what we're not saying is you should go to like a hobby shop and get like cheap brushes. Hobby meaning like a Michaels or
if you go to Michaels and they sell these brushes that are meant for canvas painting that have like the tip on the brush is 1.5 inches long.
Yeah,
it's just overkill. You can, and I have friends that I just buy a pack of 20 brushes off Amazon for $5. And it's like, I don't
want to paint that way.
But
I feel like you'd be fighting the brush for your session, and I hate that.
So you'd be fighting the brush, but also it's going to hold a tip for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's just going to break down instantaneously. I mean, maybe you make it through a couple models with it, but then it's done. And it just sounds off. But what I like about Games Workshop brushes is pretty much any hobby store that carries GW paints also carries GW brushes.
Yeah.
And I want to look a brush in the eye when I'm buying a paintbrush. I don't necessarily trust me being sent a brush over the internet unless they're 8404s or Winsor Newton Series 7. I mean, the quality control done on those is done at the source before they're shipped.
Yeah.
So, and same thing with like Opus brushes and Broken Toad and stuff like that. Like especially small companies like Broken Toad and Opus.
Yeah. Those brushes are great, by the way. I have some. They're good.
To try those.
Yeah, I got the little box set of 4 of them. They're really good. They're expensive.
They're doing another
good.
Kickstarter.
Are they?
For another. I think for a different shape or different. Maybe they're more full bellied or something. I don't know.
Okay. All right.
So we'll see. All the painting influencers have started making posts about Opus brushes.
And I know that for some of you that are not really paintbrushes, this is a deep hole.
Right. We're getting into some serious paintbrush nerding out here. Like, did you see Mark Masklin's post about Opus brushes?
And I'm excited.
Yeah. I spend a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about lists and list building, and I spend a lot of time thinking about painting. So this kind of stuff is cool to me. So I'm happy to be here. But I like being able to choose my brush. So that is an advantage of going to, like, say, Michael's to find a brush. But they're not designed to kind of perform the same function. Yeah. Especially the super cheap brushes.
Yeah.
And the really nice, like, oil painting brushes or acrylic painting brushes are usually too big.
Yeah, because they're doing on canvas. They're huge.
Yeah, or they don't have. I don't know. It's weird. They don't have the belly that a miniature painting brush has. I don't know why, but
because that's a good point though. Like miniature painting, the way we're doing it, it's essentially like a watercolor, really. Yeah. In some ways, and the belly, meaning the round diameter
like
chunk,
the
fat of the brush. Yeah. That's where the paint is stored, and you want it to flow. You want it to flow from out there, but not too much. Right. You don't want it to slop. So if you have paint on a brush and you tip it and it just sort of pools out, that's too much. It's too fast. But if you do it so that you can move it and leave a line, that's almost right there. But if it's too thick, then the line kind of breaks apart. So that the flow of the paint is
you have to have enough of a belly there to
hold that,
to hold it. Versus like a lot of acrylic brushes, like they're just meant to just pick up paint and drop it.
Yeah.
And pick up paint and drop it.
Yeah.
And it's not, it doesn't have that distance to travel. So they're like you said, I hadn't thought of it, but they are designed like a watercolor brush.
Yeah.
Just a very small watercolor brush.
Yes.
And people that are going to Michael for hobby supplies to do watercolors are painting,
huge chunks
4 foot by 4 foot canvases.
Yeah.
They need, they want a lot. They have no use for a brush that size.
That small. So it's like a tiny, tiny watercolor painting. Essentially is what it is. Yeah.
But so the brush itself is important, but don't, like we talked about in the airbrush, don't feel like you have to go buy a $400 airbrush.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to go out and buy a $25 brush to get better.
Yeah. I think
that being said,
don't go cheap and don't get something.
They are a better tool.
Yeah, they are.
So I got into a point with my brush, and what we're really talking about here is brush control.
Yeah. Right.
And controlling the paint as it comes out of the brush. And that is a fundamental skill for miniature painting.
Yep.
And it's one, and this is, the least satisfying answer is practice.
Yeah. Just like the airbrush, surprisingly. There's no shortcuts.
Just practice. It just takes practice. It just takes reps. So it just takes you painting to get better at brush control.
Yeah.
And using a bad brush is much harder to get better at brush control than it is to use a good brush and try and figure out how to use it.
Yeah.
And because a better brush will control the paint better.
Yep.
And if you can control the paint better, that gives you more focus on how you're applying the paint and where you're applying the paint versus loading up a crappy brush and then you go to put it on the model and it just goes and it's just everywhere and like you said, you're fighting it.
Yeah.
So if you have a good enough tool, it frees up your mind and it frees up your skills to work on other parts that are more useful.
Yeah. So I feel like the Citadel, the GW brushes are kind of the if you're serious about getting better, I think those are the floor. Like those are the entry to me.
Yeah.
And when you pick it out, look for the tips because you're right. They could be a little bit different. The quality.
Yeah, don't get the ones where they shove the plastic tip on and then the most outside bristles are now sticking sideways.
Yeah, because that's not coming back. Yeah, yeah.
You are never saving that.
Yeah,
brush.
but the thing is, know that there are brushes even better than that, and the red Kolinsky Sable. There's 4 different. Basically, Da Vinci, Raphael, Winsor Newton, and then Opus. Opus is the smaller company, but those are the big ones.
Right.
I've tried all of them, and I don't know that there's a huge difference between brands. It's basically just the fact that it has that one little animal's
if it's a Kolinsky Sable brush and it's in that $18 to $22 a brush range, it's probably a pretty darn good brush. And
so you could go on up from there.
There's some crazy brushes out there, but I don't know. Well, at what point you're at diminishing returns, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't even know what a $50 paintbrush would do.
I think $20 is probably about like you're getting really a really nice brush and just not going to get much.
But it's one of those things that you can live on GW brushes for a while, but then if your birthday's coming up or Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate is coming up, and your family, because family members go, what can I get you?
Yeah,
and it's never something for your army.
Yeah,
ever.
Yeah.
Never. But you don't want to ask for a gift card or something lame. This is a really easy thing to say, hey, I'd really like a nice paintbrush.
Yeah.
And kind of give them some options and say, these sizes or these, any of these brands in either a size 0 or a size 1. And that's really where you want to stay. You don't want to get a size 2 isn't going to be doing anything for you.
No.
A size 00 is overkill.
Yeah. Size 1 and size 0 are almost perfect.
Yeah.
If you get one of each of those, because that's all I use.
Yeah.
I have that Opus set and they have 4 brushes. I use 2. The other 2
because it has a 2 and a 00?
Yeah, it does.
So the 00 is maybe like an iris on an eye.
Yeah, maybe. And
but
I don't even need that.
But it's the thing with the 00 is it's too small to have a belly.
Yeah.
So you can't.
It's too hard to push paint out. It doesn't flow as well as I want it to.
No. So that's a great thing because if you're like, I don't know if I want to spend $20 on a paintbrush, that's a great thing to put on some kind of wish list or something where
there you go.
You can't really go wrong. You get this really cool tool, and then you'll be able to see you have the experience with the kind of lower quality brushes.
Yeah.
That you'll be able to notice a difference.
Yeah. Now, painting with a brush, if you listen to Duncan's famously says thin coats. And he's absolutely correct. you should be using maybe not too thin coats, but you should be using thin coats. Now, when I first got into the hobby and I didn't know how to paint, and there wasn't a whole lot of like tutorials out there. It was really nothing. Basically, I read an article that somebody wrote, and it was about, okay, first of all, use a palette. I'm like, what the heck's a pallet? And I used like a CD case.
Right.
Because it was a perfectly flat plastic spot, right? And they said, okay, always thin your paints. You always use a little bit of drop of water and a little bit of paint and mix it up and then go. And they didn't tell me how thin it should be.
Right.
But once you get in the habit of thinning paints, you thin your paints. Yeah. And it's much like, it's basically the paint has to be thicker than airbrush paint because airbrush has got to go through, well, it could be actually the same size, but the thinner the paint, the more it's going to flow off the brush. Right. So you got to be a little more control.
Yes.
But you want to thin your paints because paints will dry real quick, and you want to basically have them
evenly.
They will dry nice and even when it's nice and thin.
Yeah.
So basically, the technique is you thin your paints. You thin paints with water on a palette. And you do a little twist to get to set the tip again, and then you paint, and that's essentially it.
Yeah,
and that is painting, and everything else is really controlling where those strokes go.
Yeah, and that is something that again practice, but it's something you'll get a feel for. Mm-hmm. I work with the little white plastic pallets from Michaels.
Yeah,
you get 10 for $2 or whatever.
Yeah.
I think they're watercolor palettes. And then a lot of people work with wet palettes. I have never been able to make a wet palette work for me. Ever.
Really?
Never. Can't do it. It gets too diluted.
No.
For me.
Yeah.
I find it's really hard for me to control the viscosity of the paint.
Interesting. Okay.
And I spend more time trying to even out the viscosity than I do continually thinning the paint that's on the plastic palette.
Yeah.
So like as you're sitting there, the water's evaporating and the paint's thickening back up.
Thickening back up, yep.
But then I'll just dip the brush, mix a little bit more, and to where I'm not thinning necessarily, depending on how hot it is, of course, but I'm not thinning every time I load the brush, but maybe every other time, but it's just these little adjustments.
Yeah.
But I know exactly how to get there and exactly how to control it because I've been painting forever. You know, the type of palette that you use depends on what you like using.
Yeah.
Wet palette, I love the idea of a wet palette.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
Interesting you don't use one.
Nope.
No. So I do.
Most good painters I know use a wet palette.
The reason I use it, and this is the reason why it's not, so what a wet palette is, you go online, I think,
it's a sponge with some butcher paper on top.
That's literally it. Yes, it's a little plastic container. Yeah. I went out and bought the P3 wet palette, but it's literally a plastic box with the sponge that you soak in water, and you put butcher paper, not wax paper.
No,
but it's parchment paper.
Parchment paper.
Parchment paper over the top. And essentially, what it does is the parchment paper holds a level of moisture from the sponge, and when you put paint on there, it keeps the paint wet, so it doesn't dry out.
Right.
And it will keep that paint wet, especially if you close it and seal it. It'll keep the paint wet for days.
Yeah.
And you can open it back up and it's still wet.
Yeah.
And the reason you keep it wet is because paint will dry on a palette. And but like you said, you're so used to just adding a little water, kind of keeping it going, that it's not as much of an issue. Or maybe you're just so used to it, you don't worry about it anymore. Yeah.
It's not something I really have to think about.
Yeah.
It's just part of the motion of painting for me at this point, but I've been using this exact same palette. I have a stack of them, but I love the idea of a wet palette that if I could get the paint to the consistency that I want on the wet palette and it would stay there in that consistency, that would be a dream. I would love that.
But at this point, you're like, well,
gets more diluted, and then I have to add a little more paint, and then I'm now all of a sudden this one color's taking up a quarter of the wet palette because I keep moving it around.
Because it will get messy. And what I typically use the wet palette for, you're right. If you add too much water to it, it becomes messy, and you don't do that motion where you keep adding water to keep it going. If you do it too much, the paint essentially becomes just a mess.
Or it's just water.
Paint that's thin too hard just drips everywhere. Yeah. But the thing I like about the wet palette is I usually use it when I'm blending two colors. Yes. So with wet blending, I think it works really well. That's really what it's almost perfect for.
Yeah.
So, But however you use it, whether you use a pallet or a wet pallet, you use a pallet. That's really just...
don't paint straight out of the pot. But I think if I had gone on to wet pallets earlier in my painting journey, because I'd already, by the time wet pallets were really like, woo. And I was even looking at one, there's a European company that launched a cool looking wet pallet that I liked. I think if I had, and after 7 years, and I'm very happy with the results I get painting. So maybe later it's something I'll look at, but right now, if I come across it maybe 2 or 3 years into my painting career, I think it's something that if I could have gotten the hang of earlier, then I would absolutely be using a wet palette.
Yeah.
I think it's something is if you're still at a point, this is not to say in any way that I've peaked or I don't have any room for improvement, because I absolutely do. I have to crank out models right now.
Yeah. It's a job for you, right? I mean,
so I'm not doing any revolutionary, soul searching, time intensive, adjustments right now. But if it's something where you're on your painting journey, you're looking for ways to get better, I think trying out a wet palette is a great thing to kind of try and figure out, because if you can get it figured out, it will save time and it will enable some of those techniques like you talked about with wet blending or even just glazing and stuff that I have to spend more time mixing and kind of getting everything right before I do those versus just having the paint there ready to go. Yeah. Which would be a huge benefit. So definitely, and there are plenty of YouTube videos. You do not have to go buy a wet palette.
You do not.
There are plenty of YouTube videos about making your own wet palette with about 13 cents worth of materials.
And you will find a million of them.
Like, do you have a Tupperware? Do you have a sponge?
Yeah.
Do you have parchment paper?
Done. That's it.
That's literally, you have a wet palette in your kitchen right now.
Pretty much. Yep.
So that being said, it's easier. It's nice to have. I had the P3 one. So you have the sheet, you just rip off the sheet, you throw it down and you're ready to go. So.
But either way, I think it's essentially, it is a different level of tool, but what it's there for is, here's the thing. Oftentimes people will mention something like you should try XYZ. But you'll see here, you should try this thing, whatever this thing is. Right. This thing is, people go out and they get that thing and they're like, oh, but it's not magically curing my, it's not making my stuff better. Right. Again, it's just a tool. So the wet palette allows the paint to stay wet. A palette itself is a palette. A normal palette, which is the shiny piece of plastic, the stuff will dry out. Right. But whatever works for you is really what you should be going with. And, a wet palette just offers a different way to paint. You still have to control the viscosity of the paint, which is sort of the thickness of it. And really what you're looking for is flow. And if you ever watch those YouTube videos, I didn't used to do this and I never understood why they do it, but you'll take the paint and they'll take the brush and they'll draw a line or two on their hand. Right. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that to see that it's flowing correctly out of the brush. Right. And do you do that as well?
If I'm out in the world, I'll probably have paint on my thumb.
Yeah, because you're like paint. Okay, perfect. I got the flow down.
Well,
nice.
And set the tip of the brush. Make sure that it's the right flow. Yep. So usually, and I try to wash it off before I leave the house.
No, that's fine.
The first time I went to meet my old gaming group, there was a big meetup of the gaming group, and one of my friends in the group had invited me to this meetup. I had known him from outside. I didn't know anybody else in the group. I just knew this one guy. His name's Austin. He was actually my first commission client. And he was like, oh, do you have a gaming group? I said, no. He said, oh, come meet my gaming group. We're all meeting at, downtown, 2 weeks or whatever. Sure. So I go and meet him, and I've been painting earlier in the day, and I, hold the miniature in my left hand and I'm mixing, and then I'll put a line on my thumb to test and then go about painting. And so I'm painting. I'm like, oh, I have to go meet these guys. So I, jump in the car and drive down there, and I'm meeting him. And like, one of the first things he said to me was like, oh man, this guy's got paint on his thumb too. Like, he's, one of us.
One of us.
It's definitely, just kind of one of those habits at this point. But
I think the paint on the thumb. Yeah. Paint on the thumb shows that you are,
but you're thinking about it.
You're thinking about the flow. You don't have to use your thumb, obviously, but it just happens to be right there.
And some people are like, oh, don't use your thumb. You get the oils from your skin mixed in with the paint or whatever. And I don't operate at that level where I would even notice. So, it's not like I'm going and eating popcorn and then running my paintbrush through it before painting my models,
or you could draw it on the palette as well. And you see Duncan do that all the time. Yeah. He just does a little. The point is, you're testing the flow before you put it on the model. I think it's really good.
And setting the tip.
And setting the tip, for sure.
Yeah.
So the thing about wet, and I don't remember where I learned this from, but it was painting white, or no, it was a light gray. And painting really light colors with a brush is hard because, first of all, it's chalky,
awful.
It's thin, and you have to put multiple coats over that.
Right.
But one of the things that you do when you paint brush, or you use a brush to put paint on the model, that paint is wet. And when it's still wet, you can blend it. You can do wet blending techniques where you put another color and you start to blend the colors together, right? However, at some point the paint becomes sticky and tacky.
Right.
And if you go back over that again with more paint, thinking, "Oh, I missed this. I'll just put more paint over the top." You'll rip the surface tension of that paint, and it's just a big fat mess.
Yes.
It is a mess.
You're done.
So
you're done.
When you paint, you have to let it dry.
Right.
You either use it right then and you blend it or whatever you're going to do, or typically you just let it dry. You don't try to go back over and put more paint over the top thinking you're going to, fill
even
it out. You're not evening anything out.
No. That's something that and that's another reason to thin your paints is to avoid that, because the thinner your paint, the faster it's going to dry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing I still do this.
Sure.
I'll get impatient.
Yeah.
And I'll try and I'll just highlight it real quick. And then, and then I hit it and I'm like, oh, because then now you have to go back and fix it. But the thicker the paint is going on, the longer it's going to take to dry, and the longer it's going to have that kind of the surface of the paint's going to dry first, and then the longer it takes to dry, they get deeper into the paint that's sitting there. So if you go to do that second coat and that first coat isn't completely dry, it's gonna shift.
Yeah,
it's just gonna look. That's where you get those brush strokes, and that's where you get all those, those kind of bumps and stuff in your paint. Whereas if you're doing, like you said,
thin
if you're doing a thin coat and you let it completely dry and you do another thin coat, you're gonna get that coverage.
Yeah,
and it's gonna be smooth. That's one of the things one of the reasons I really prefer batch painting is I don't run into that as much.
You just move to the next one.
By the time I get done with the 5th or 6th or 20th guy, that first thing that I did is dry. Yeah. So I can just
and it's painting in thin coats is probably the thing that, again, Duncan's famous for it, but it's absolutely important. And
there's a reason he says it 20 times in every single video.
Because he's basically telling you need to paint.
It is the most important thing.
Yeah. Don't feel like you need to that's the thing, is you've got to be some level, there's got to be some level of patience, because if you make your paint too thick because you're trying to cover stuff, it's going to be messy. It's got to be the thickness it's got to be. And if the paint is if you're trying to paint white over black, probably start with a gray first.
Right.
So there's ways to build up the color. You don't have to jump in.
If you're painting yellow, start with brown.
Exactly.
You find something that we've talked about pigment density before.
But the density of the pigment.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not going to cover black with white.
No, you're just not.
Because you would have to build up so many layers.
Yep.
But gray.
Yeah,
is great.
Gray is
what is Celestra? What's the GW one? Celestra Gray.
Yeah, Celestra Gray.
That's the one that's
their generic
covered.
is
I use a couple different grays from Game Color, I think.
Yeah,
but they're both gray.
Yeah,
and then the highlight is
the white, but by then you built up to it.
Right.
So it's and that's the thing too. The thin coats is great, but it's also thinking about the paint going over the other paint especially when you're trying to cover it up. And so let's go in a little bit about priming, for example.
Yep.
Now, when you prime, I go back and forth. So now I'm painting yellow.
I use so many different
I know. Now that I'm painting yellow, I paint I prime them white.
Yep.
And white is an annoying primer to work with because it doesn't, and I use the Games Workshop primer, which is expensive, but even then, it's still an annoying primer to work with. The best primer I've found is just a generic gray. I use Games Workshop primers, and I recognize that they're more expensive. I just have never had a model ruined by using any of the color primers that Games Workshop has. That's me.
Yeah.
That's me. So
and I'm sure you catch grief for using.
Yeah, people are like, oh man, it's like $15 a can.
But it works for you.
It works. Yeah.
So use that.
Yeah.
And that's probably the number one thing that number one piece of advice that I give people in the hobby is like, is if that works for you.
Sure. Like you said,
that.
You don't use wet pallets, or you haven't really right now. The pallet system you have now works just fine.
Right.
Yeah. And
because I would never buy a can of GW primer.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't. I can't justify the cost.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. Not at the volume you're doing new.
Well, but not even that. But it's just I use Osh primer.
Mm-hmm.
There's a hardware store in California. It's called Orchard Supply Hardware. They've since gone out of business, but I bought like 24 cans of this stuff before they went out of business.
You're killing me with this. Because you're just that's why I think they went out of business, but everyone bought up these ridiculous cans.
Right.
You're part of the problem.
There were a lot of posts about that
while that thing was
going.
Anyway,
but it's basically just standard spray primer for lawn furniture. I mean, for whatever you want to paint.
Yeah.
So, but this stuff is great. It's self-leveling. It dries matte. But it's only black.
Mm-hmm.
Their white is unusable.
Yeah.
So I use that on anything that has anything resin.
Mm-hmm.
I will prime with spray primer. Halfords, I think in the UK is like a car primer.
Yeah.
That's great. There are really good primer at Home Depot for car primer, basically.
Yeah.
Or I forget what. Anyway, there are really good primers that you can get because Home Depot, or not Home Depot, but Osh didn't have a proprietary blend for their primer. Somebody manufactured this primer somewhere, and Osh put their label on it and sold it.
Yeah.
So that you can find that same kind of primer in a lot of different hardware stores. That being said, you really want to test any of those primers out because a lot of them just go on way too thick and they'll destroy all your models.
They will, and that's the thing that I worry the most about.
Yes.
I have used primers before that have had a really high pigment density, and it has ruined models.
Oh, for sure.
And it does not get stripped off because it's so
it's
so dense.
You're done.
It's gone. So
you're calling Aaron and he's giving you $5.
Yeah. Trader A is going to be buying this model.
Yeah. So you want to be careful. You want to ask. But so for anything resin, I still have my stash of Osh primer, and then I use airbrush primer. I really
that's Styleros.
I prefer
Vallejo primer. Okay.
I will use Stylin Rens, which is Badger's brand, which is good. I think I prefer the Vallejo. They're very comparable.
Yeah.
But they have their own issues. Like they can get kind of snotty and gum up, and then they shoot, like a shotgun sometimes, just spraying stuff everywhere. So they can be challenging to work with. But the benefit to airbrush primer is it's not climate dependent. Yeah. You can be 20 degrees and snowing outside, and I'm still priming away.
Yeah.
Very well ventilated area.
Yeah, sure.
But so the biggest advantage is that level of control.
Mm-hmm. And you don't want to use a rattle can in a house. You really don't want to use a rattle can
even
in a
if you're
house.
Single. I mean, my wife would absolutely murder me if I was spray priming upstairs in a box.
So that's the nice thing about having airbrush primers. And the two ones are the Vallejo and the Style.
Vallejo and Stylin Rens are the two Stylins, whatever. They're the two big ones. Vallejo's probably the biggest. Yeah. And they do make colored primers. They make a ton of colored primers, actually.
Nice.
Because they do mostly military modeling.
Yeah.
So they have this great kind of brownish red that I really like for stuff like terrain, or if anything's to be like super rusted out underneath, then I'll use that. That's great. Their white is actually pretty good.
Okay.
But I'll usually prime black and then prime white. Because a white's just not going to stick and it's not going to cover.
Yeah.
It's going to be weird.
And a nice white primer will stick. We talked about painting white with a brush over black is really hard, but if you can dust it, or not dust it, sorry, you can spray white on black and it actually will cover. Yeah. And it also gives you, that's the zenithal high. It's kind of like it gives it right there all in one big thing.
And because you want, like there are multiple different uses, but in general, you want those shadows to be darker.
Yeah.
But I've also just found that trying to spray white primer on bare plastic is tough.
It is tough.
But I 99% of the time I paint, I'll prime black, and I'll usually defer weather depending
Yeah.
Because even if it's 20 degrees and sunny, if it's 105 degrees outside, you're not priming either.
No.
Then I'll usually defer to the spray, especially anything involving resin, just because it adheres better. The airbrush primers do not adhere real well to resin.
Yeah.
So you can really run into some problems especially if you're doing masking.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
It'll just pull it right off.
There are dozens of times that I'll pull the masking tape off after painting something and it'll rip a chunk of paint right off, clean off the resin past the primer. I mean, it's bare resin.
Yeah.
And that is one of the worst feelings in hobbying.
Yeah.
I have to say.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But the whole point of a primer is to stick, to provide a painted surface to paint on.
Yes.
And
stay there.
And stay there. Yeah. And so if the airbrush doesn't cling as well as the rattle cans, then for plastics it's fine. But for resin most of the time, with the resin with the surface being what it is, you want to have
release agent and all that kind of funky stuff, then I will find a way to prime with a rattle can if it's resin. The most important thing is that the model is room temperature and the can is room temperature.
Yes.
So like priming, my can's a primer in my house.
Yeah.
Because it's, 30 degrees in my garage.
Yep.
So you can, and what I will do is I will move the cars out of the garage and I will shake the can in the kitchen, open the door, run in the garage, spray it real quick, and run back in the house.
That works.
So
it works because the temperature of the can and the bottle are the same.
Right.
There's still room, and they get colder as you go outside.
Right.
But you really only need to be outside for the fumes of crap that goes out there, and they overspray. Then you bring them back in.
And let them dry, and then flip them and do all that. But I might have to try out the GW white spray. I haven't heard anything, but
it's
good.
Not great. It is okay.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of shaking. Yeah. So
okay for white primer is
for white primer, it's okay. I've used a lot of really poor primers before. Yeah. White especially is really hard.
Gray is like if you're painting. So
gray's such a great all around kind of just generic primer.
Yeah. I'll only prime white if I'm painting white or yellow.
Yeah, I guess fair.
I'll just do black for everything else. Because especially my style of painting, I want that dark base coat. I want a really dark contrast.
Yeah.
Because I do high contrast style.
Yeah.
So I don't want a bright base coat. I want a really dark base coat. I'll work up to the bright. I can do bright with paint.
Yes. But with a white color or a yellow, it's too hard to build those layers up. So it's better to start with white.
I'd rather prime white and then paint it gray.
Mm-hmm.
And then work back up to white, then try and... It really does make a huge difference.
Yeah.
People, if you're just covering it anyway. But if you did, like if you painted half a piece of paper prime black and left the other half white, and you just sprayed horizontally over the page, you'll see in 2 seconds the kind of difference that primer color will make.
Yeah, and it's really hard to say what you should do, as one or the other, because what we're talking about is there's a lot of different kinds of primers out there.
Yeah.
This hardware store that no longer exists anymore, you went and bought 20 cans, is only in California, that only exists in
I have sources that can refer me to.
But there are, but talk to other people as far as like there are other cheap alternatives as well.
Yeah.
But the big thing about priming is that airbrush primers don't stick as well, so you got to be a little more careful about that. To resin, especially. Right. Whether you're painting black or white or gray, I kind of think just depends. I mean, you'll work it out with your style, right? Yeah. But if you're primarily paste coating yellow, which I've been doing, I'm going white. And when I do my gray Eldar, I do black. Yeah. And so it just depends on kind of what you're building up to, like what makes the most sense.
And your painting style. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about is colored primers.
Yeah.
GW makes a lot of colored primers.
Makes things a lot easier. It's quicker.
If I know Army Painter makes
colored primers as well.
The basis of their whole product line is the spray, paint, dip, shake, roll kind of system. I personally don't use colored primers, but they don't really fit how I paint either. But I also haven't had very good experience with colored primers. Yeah. So if you are just starting out or painting is not 100%, really that important at the end of the day, that's not where you want to spend your time.
Sure.
But if that's not where you want to spend your time and you want to do, it's a good way to get a pretty good looking result is by maybe using a colored primer.
Sure.
Especially, I'm going to prime this blue.
Yeah.
I'm going to wash it and I'll highlight it and it'll look pretty good.
It looks pretty good.
It's not. It's not the most advanced techniques. It's not, anything super special. But if you just want to get away from gray plastic and you just want to have an army look decent across the table, that's a great way to go. Yeah. Especially if you're trying to, I really want to play Imperial Fists.
Yep.
Well, I would not recommend playing Imperial Fists to somebody that's just starting painting because it's so hard to get them to look decent.
Yeah.
But was it Averland Sunset?
Yep. It's a great color primer.
I've seen people get fantastic results.
Yeah.
Not fantastic, but good results with, Averland Sunset, wash with whatever the yellow wash is called, or orange wash or whatever.
Yeah.
And then, go back and highlight with a lighter yellow.
Yeah. It's good.
It'll be solid yellow. And really that's 90% of the battle with yellow is just getting a solid coat.
Solid coat of yellow. That's not having to cover up like a black primer or whatever.
So that is a viable option. I know a lot of people have got great results with the Army Painter system.
Sure.
So if that's what you're comfortable with, do that.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Definitely test the primers first, though.
Oh, God.
Find a junky model.
Yes.
The Contemptor Dreadnought or the Rhino that I have. Yeah. Test them. Because
I might be reaching the limit of my Contemptor, though.
He's had too many layers on him now.
We're getting, I think it's a couple dozen different paint schemes on that guy at this point. So now I'm getting to the point where I don't know what's reacting.
Oh, yeah,
what. So I'm like doing chameleon paint on it the other day, and I'm like, is this working? I don't know. Because now it's like a gloss black enamel primer that just obliterated everything. Anyway. But yeah, definitely, especially if you're trying a new product for the first time, if you're trying a new primer for the first time, do not just walk outside and start hosing down your models with this stuff.
Yep.
Make sure that, so like if I'm trying to dash outside and prime in 20-degree weather, I'm not priming my models in 20 degrees. I'm taking that Contemptor outside and I'm spraying it real quick and I'm making sure that the can is good, that the model will accept the paint, that nothing funky has happened in the last month that I haven't used this can or anything. So, cause primer is a very, very quick way to destroy your models.
Yeah.
And so you always want to test it before you go start spraying down. Cause like most people, I'll prime a bunch of models at once.
Yeah.
So, always test it out, especially if it's a new product that you haven't used before. Always test
that's good advice.
And always read the can. Because it will tell you, and it will be different for multiple products. Like some you will need to shake forever. Some say to soak it in warm water for 10 minutes before you use it.
Yeah.
And so you always want to take a minute to read the can, which I never used to do. I just, shake it, spray it.
Yeah. But it only takes one time to ruin a model.
Yeah.
That you say, okay.
Or 17.
Yeah. Yeah.
So always read the instructions and follow the instructions, and always just give a quick little test to make sure everything's working properly before you start spraying down models. Cause there is no coming back from that.
No.
If I airbrush something poorly or if I spill a bunch of paint all over a model, I can either strip it or I can go back over it, but primer, you're done. That's never coming off.
Yep.
So.
And not to freak people out, but just do your due diligence. That's the big thing.
And be sure to, spray it from a foot away.
Yep.
Go over it once.
Yeah, the can should always be it should always be moving. Yeah. You don't sit there in one spot and spray and push the button down. You're moving it constantly.
And really you don't, and this wasn't something that I learned until later, you don't need it to necessarily be a solid.
It doesn't have to cover it completely.
Solid coat of
because you'll be out there for a long time and you'll have a layer of primer, a layer 2 of primer, a layer 3 of primer.
If it's obscuring the model underneath, then that, because really what you're looking for is something that the paint to adhere to that isn't smooth plastic.
Yeah.
Well, on a microscopic level, that's already there.
Yeah.
If it's mostly covered in primer. If it's discolored because of the primer.
Yeah.
There's enough there for the paint to adhere to.
Yeah. And you don't need to get too crazy to try to,
get in every nook and cranny.
Holding it up and over. Yeah. Just get it enough so that it covers, like you said. Yeah. And it gives you a nice finish. Cause I used to do that. I used to, oh gosh, I gotta put another coat on it. I spin these guys around this way and this way, hold from upside down. It seems excessive.
It is, but, and you'll obliterate the detail on the outside
eventually
of the model,
over time
to get to the inside of the model.
Yeah.
So a lot of times what'll happen is I'll rattle can models outside. And then when I come inside, I'll get out the airbrush and the airbrush primer. And if there's some big parts that I missed, but I didn't want to hit with the rattle can because there's not that, it's not a fine instrument.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll just go back real quick and I'll just hit it with a little bit, hit it with a little bit of the airbrush primer. That's getting, that's spending a lot of time on primer.
That's a little bit too much. Yeah. So the primer itself, I think that, like you said, you have to be careful with it. And once you have what works for you, regardless of what other people say, if you have some obscure thing that you found that really works and it works for you, then you just do it. You go with it and you just keep doing it.
And this is kind of a broader statement and addressing kind of a broader issue in miniature painting.
Yeah.
Is don't change something just to change it.
Sure.
Or just because you think, because everybody else is doing this one thing.
Yeah.
That it's necessarily going to improve your painting.
Yeah.
Because if you're getting good results and you can see improvement but it's a fine line, right? Because you do want to try new things.
Yeah.
But if you're getting consistent good results out of a product.
Yep.
And all of a sudden 20 people online start posting about another product.
Yeah.
That's great. Let them use that product. Maybe that's what works for them.
Yeah.
But don't feel like, oh, maybe I've been using the wrong product for the last 5 years. So I need to go try this other product because it's new and shiny.
Sure.
Don't.
Yeah.
Don't just use what works for you, especially with something that's so critical like primer.
Yeah.
If it's a new paint line or something, sure, try it out. But it's something that's so finicky, like varnish. But you use what works.
Yep.
And just keep using it.
Yeah. And so I think you using what works and keep using it, especially because you don't need to improve primer. Right. It just works. Right. So it's one thing to try out.
I'm so much better at priming than I was 2 years ago.
Because of this thing. There's other things you want to try out to get better, but primer is primer. And then let's get to the very end of the model itself. When you are finished painting and you're finishing a model.
Yes.
This is also something we talked about, primer being careful to spray out in the cold and also the humidity, but it is nothing worse than spraying a final coat of varnish on a model and having it cloud up and fog up. And I have had that.
Me too.
Because it was cold.
It's so soul crushing.
It is, because you spend all that time painting that model and you can't come back from that. So here's what I use. I will use Vallejo through an airbrush. I'll use like a coat. It doesn't really matter. Sometimes I use the gloss coat. Sometimes if I'm going to put decals on or transfers, but I'll through the airbrush, I'll do some kind of a coating to seal it during the airbrush sessions or painting sessions. But at the very end, I use Tester's Dull Coat. Yep. You can also use Model Master Dull Coat, but it's one of those things that's kind of like,
it's $8 for like
a tiny little can, and it has a certain scent to it to me that smells like the model's finished.
Right.
But this stuff it's dull coat. It's a matte coat, and it will dull anything you've done that's shiny. But to me, it is the best way to seal the model at the very end. And if you do it in a very carefully controlled, it's not too cold. Right. I actually will spray it inside. I'll use a little spray booth sometimes because it's not too bad. It's not quite as bad. It's a smaller can.
And that is really just,
and it's
just a dust.
You do dusting it. You do not want to coat it. It should not have a texture.
Right.
It is there to put a protective clear coating over it. And you got to be very careful when you spray it. And you got to keep moving with it. But that's what I use.
Yeah.
So how are you varnishing or protecting your models?
And a lot of people do. And that is fantastic stuff. Yeah. I use varnish through the airbrush.
Varnish through the airbrush.
So I will, because of that control.
Yeah.
So I will, and I have different, because varnish is such a tricky thing. Mm-hmm. It can be really temperamental.
Yeah. And you don't want it to be.
And it is a surefire way to ruin everything.
Yeah.
Because you're done at that point. Ruining a model through primers, like, gosh, crap. I'm out of this money and, the model's all messed up. Ruining a model with varnish is one of the worst experiences.
It's terrible. It's really bad.
And like, I'm like feeling the pain that I felt. So and everybody's had this happen.
Yep.
Most everybody. I use Liquitex gloss varnish through the airbrush.
Yep.
Because it's always worked for me.
Yeah.
Gloss varnish is the least finicky out of the bunch.
Yeah.
Gloss varnish is you're pretty much whatever. You just hose down whatever.
And it's setting it. Because you don't want a glossy model for the most part. I mean, maybe, but most part you don't really want a glossy model.
No, you don't. But I use gloss varnish on things like canopies on planes or Eldar tanks or something like that. I'll use a gloss varnish. But in general, no, you don't want. But you do want a gloss. So like I'll gloss varnish metal models before matte varnish because it's a thicker, it's almost like candy coating them to kind of try and protect them. Yeah. And with a gloss varnish, you can go over it with a matte. Yeah. And it will dull it down. It doesn't usually get it all the way back though. It usually kind of stops at sat. Yeah. Because really matte varnish is just less dense gloss varnish. Yeah. It's all the same stuff. So I use Liquitex because I can buy it in large quantities and it's cheap and it works really well. Yep. Especially when, like you said, doing transfers, there'll be and one of the things I like about using it through the airbrush is I can do a thin coat of gloss varnish where I want the transfer, do the transfer, do another thin coat of gloss varnish over it, and then matte varnish. Yep. So with the airbrush, I'm able to build up those thin layers of varnish versus trying to spray it with a can. Yep. And then I use satin varnish for metallics. Yeah. So like my Custodes and stuff are all finished with a satin varnish. Yeah, because the satin, it gives it just it has a nice hue to it, but it's not blingy. Right. It's not like it doesn't look like you gloss varnish a model because you didn't. Gloss is too much. Satin is somewhere in between matte and gloss. Yep. And I was super skeptical. Really, I used to just matte varnish
because the matte felt like something. Because that's what I do.
But then,
interesting.
But then when you're painting the models that are fully metallic, Necrons, Custodes, I was painting my Custodes and I was really, really happy with them until I matte varnished them. Interesting. And I was like, oh God, that really just killed.
It just flattened out
flattened out everything. Yeah. And I'm like, what just happened? And so I have a friend of mine. So he's the guy. He kind of pushes me. He'll send me, like, I won't talk to him for 3 months and I'll post something on Instagram and he'll send me a message like, you need to up your contrast or something. I'm like, oh, you're right. But damn, I was so happy with that. But it's good. He's a great guy. But he was the one that suggested using satin varnish on the metallic models. And I was like, yeah, but I don't want it to be shiny. Yeah. I don't want these shiny. I think because there's a very thin line between, hey, that looks good and like, oh, that's really kind of kitschy. And yeah. It just, you're like, well, you're trying to make it look shiny without painting it shiny. Like, what do you, so he was like, well, just use satin. And I was like, well, yeah, but it's not like, I want it to look old. I want it, and he designs jewelry. That's his job is he makes jewelry. And he was like, well, look at all this jewelry. So he sent me pictures of like gold and it's all shiny, it's all shiny. Yeah. So then I sprayed it with just a satin varnish and holy smokes, it just completely changed.
But it doesn't look gaudy. So it's basically, it's exactly what satin is, right?
It's not shiny. You don't look at it and go, oh my God, that's a shiny, polished model. Yeah. It just looks kind of like shiny metal. Yeah. So satin, and I use AK for satin varnish. And that stuff's really cool because it has they put this almost little purple additive in it. So because you can't see it when you're spraying it. You can't really see it's clear, right? So they put an additive in it that you can see how thick it's going on. You can see where it's going on when you're airbrushing.
It just disappears when it dries.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. And then I use Vallejo matte varnish through. And those are the brands that work for me, and it's annoying, and believe me, it's annoying for me.
You really just this varnish that
I have honed in on
this level of varnish you've got. Your varnish game's out of control.
You didn't even know when you asked me.
I did not even know
how far we were going to go down the varnish rabbit hole.
I was like, wow.
But it's because, and again, for me too, there is a little bit of a cost issue because I paint so many models. I can't tester stall coat every model. No. I will spend hundreds of dollars a year on tester stall coat, which I'm not really prepared to do.
And there's not enough that's sold in the Valley. Occasionally you'll go to a hobby store. Oh, there's one. I better grab it.
Right. Yeah. And, and that's something that, they can't ship to you.
No, they can't. You got to buy it.
Physically, you can't ship it. So,
yeah. But it makes sense that that's kind of how you're rolling with it. So, I mean, what we're talking about.
It's climate independent.
It's climate independent.
I can varnish anytime, anywhere. It's always 70 degrees in my house. Yeah. So.
I think the Citadel Purity Seal, on the other hand, I would avoid that.
It has the worst reputation.
Maybe it's better. I had a bad experience with it once. I'm just saying,
everybody's
once bitten, once twice shy.
Yeah.
I figure I don't think I want to. Yeah, I wouldn't go. So there are.
I've heard the new
it's probably better
in Games Workshop's defense. They did change the formula. I've heard the new formula is fine.
Yep.
Most people I know got burned by the previous formula.
Yeah.
And will never touch the stuff, myself included.
Yeah.
I just won't do it.
Not at that stage. So it's funny because you're right. Priming is important, really important, and you can ruin a model if you prime it incorrectly. But at that point, you're out the model.
Yeah.
Everything you do when you're painting, if you're using thin coats, if you're being very diligent about stuff, you can correct, you can fix, you can make a mistake and fix.
Yeah.
If you varnish it incorrectly, you've ruined it. There's nothing you can't come back from that. Really, you can strip it.
There is a small chance. There is a very small chance, and this has actually worked for me one time. So I thought, hey, Liquitex gloss varnish, why not try their matte varnish? Mm-hmm. Don't try their matte varnish because it did exactly what we're talking about, where it frosted.
Yeah.
I was painting the 8th edition, the Primera side of the 8th edition box for a buddy of mine for his store. And these guys are black, and it frosted on black.
Which is the worst.
Armor.
Yeah.
There's no covering that up. And so I started freaking out because this was like 2 days before he needed them for his store for the launch of 8th edition. So I'm messaging these people, look, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? How do I save this? And, most people are like, you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you gloss varnish over it.
It covers up some of it.
And then matte varnish it again.
Yeah.
It can, I don't know why it works, but if you gloss varnish, if it's frosted and you gloss varnish it, that will get rid of the frost. And then you can matte varnish over
with
the
gloss different matte varnish.
We'll obviously use a different product.
Yeah.
And that can save it.
Yeah. If it depends on the extent.
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
This was very mild. This was not, they didn't turn white or anything.
Yeah.
This was a more mild frosting to where it was only on the underside of the legs. And so I did this, and I also just kind of painted some areas black again that I could. But for the most part, if the varnish betrays you.
Yep. So the system then basically, like I'll use a Vallejo gloss and then a dull coat over the top.
Yeah.
Although I try to be very careful with the gloss because that Tester's dull coat's good, but it won't cover everything.
Right.
And if it's really, really glossy, no matter what you use, it's not going to work.
Right.
So I use the gloss coat just for usually where I'm going to put transfers or like a dusting just to seal it. You're using Liquitex. You use 3 different kinds, but you're using of different applications, and basically.
Yeah. So I won't.
Liquitex.
Most of the time, if I'm not doing transfers, I will just matte varnish a model when I'm done.
That's probably the best way to do it.
I mean, I just don't. If I'm not doing transfers, the satin is very situational.
Satin is only like you talk about for the Custodes.
For like Custodes and
your matte varnish was what was the brand for the matte varnish?
Vallejo. And I don't thin it. I don't touch it.
Yeah.
And it comes out pretty thick.
Yeah.
But I just crank the pressure. I just crank the pressure on my.
Do it
on my
quickly. You're not blasting it, and then
Right. But I mean, I'll shoot at 50 PSI. I mean, I don't care.
Yeah.
Whatever gets it out of the airbrush, because I'm so paranoid about thinning it. Like if I add water to this,
is it going to screw the viscosity?
Is this going to be a problem?
Yeah.
So that's what works. That's what I use. It is a pain, but I get consistent results. So, and if you don't have an airbrush and you can only varnish outside, you can wait until spring to varnish your models.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't risk it.
No.
Just wait, and priming's a little different animal because you want to have something, if you run out of primed models in the middle of winter, you want to be able to paint.
Yeah.
But varnishing your models is not critical enough that it's worth risking it.
Absolutely not.
In bad conditions.
Yep.
Just wait.
Yep, for sure.
And do it later.
Yep.
Do a big batch later when it's 70 degrees outside.
Yep.
Don't force it.
Yeah. So that's the life cycle of painting. There's one more thing I want to make sure I mention too, is the Games Workshop paint holder is the three sizes of that. That is surprisingly a very good tool. Like I was really skeptical. I was like really. Now you use corks and you basically put them on.
I don't actually. I use bases.
Oh, because bases, you can hold the bases.
Right. So, and I don't know if that's like crippling my hand, as I go, but I'll use I'll pin stuff to bases. I'll just make a long pin and like pin helmets to it.
Yeah.
Mostly because I don't drink, so I don't have a bunch of corks lying around.
Yep.
I'm not really willing to Amazon corks. But I have them. I have a million bases. So I've not tried the paint holder yet. I've heard good things.
The good thing, I guess the point is that you don't want to be touching what you're painting.
Right.
So whether it's you're holding it by the base or you're using the holder that holds the paint, the base. Right. Essentially, it's just a more ergonomic way to hold a model.
But I have a friend that was having really bad cramps in his hands and stuff, and he was a huge skeptic with the paint handle. Like these, who's spending $8 on one of these things?
Because GW, to be fair, has put out some stupid stuff. Like tools and hobby stuff. They put out dumb stuff.
They have put out some winners in the past at a huge markup.
Yeah.
But he finally, because he was having like really bad problems with his hands, and he finally broke down and bought a couple paint handles and was like, where have these things been all my life?
Yeah.
Like, this is incredible.
Yeah.
So I'm not anti-paint handle, but for me personally, it's also kind of a functional thing or a practical thing where I paint in large batches.
Yeah.
So if I do not want to go spend $250
on all those paint handles,
30 paint handles,
some people that do.
Everybody I'm painting then the real estate that's going to take up on my desk with 30 paint handles on my desk with little dudes on them.
It is true. I think honestly, because I paint in batches of about 5.
Right.
So it's fine.
Yeah.
And I only have one, and I don't use it all the time.
Yeah.
But the gist of it though is that however you grip the model, you want to make sure you have enough to be able to hold your hand steady. You're not holding your hands in space. Usually you're putting your fingers and things and you're bracing it against elements of the model, and the handle just provides more areas where you can kind of put your fingers to sort of hold it.
Yeah.
And that's really, whether you use a handle, whether you use cork, whether you just hold the base.
Right.
However you paint, if you're running out of if you're finding that you can't hold your hand steady,
right,
you just want to brace your elbows or your forearms or your fingers in a way that you can do that so you can be more steady.
Well, and what I'll do is I'll put them on oversized bases. So like if it's a 25 millimeter infantry, I'll put them on a 32 millimeter base or a 40 millimeter base.
Yeah. So it's much more area.
So it's a lot. Yeah. I'm not putting guys on 25 millimeter bases and sitting there and trying to, so I'll put them on an oversized base, and that gives me more real estate to hold on to, and there's more there.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I'm hesitant to try a paint handle is I think I might actually love it, and then now I gotta start stockpiling these things to try and get it, make room on my desk. So
I don't want to buy 30 of these.
I don't want 30 of these things hanging out. Blow my hobby budget on paint handles. But as time goes on, maybe I will find a use for them, or maybe I just use them for character models or something.
Fine.
So
yeah, that's kind of how I use them.
But again, it's another, that assembly one looks really cool.
Yeah.
How many of us sat there with a fiddly thing
you're sitting there holding the darn thing in place. Yeah.
The worst, you just put it down and the thing falls off, and then you just want to throw it against the wall.
Oh yeah.
But again, it's another tool in the toolbox. Try it out. If it works for you, great.
And then you just go with it.
Yeah.
And that's I guess you mentioned that earlier in the podcast, and I think it's a good way to kind of end this particular episode, is that over time you just develop tools and things that you enjoy and you stand by, and it's great to try new things if you feel like that's going to push your skills, but there's no reason to go out and try something new just because a bunch of people thought this is a cool thing you should do.
Right.
Try it. Don't be shut down to new ideas, but if a primer works for you, if a varnish works for you, you just keep going with that.
I mean,
if a paint color for this color, I want to use this brand of paint.
Right.
You don't have to stick to GW. You don't have to use all Vallejo. You don't have to use all scale.
Right.
There's a lot of paints out there. Well, and not all of them are great.
And that's a great thing. And just briefly, to talk about paints, because we didn't really touch on paint, because we touched on paint so much in the airbrushing segments. Every paint line has its strengths and weaknesses.
Yep.
And over time, you'll try out new paints, and you'll try out new, finding those strengths and weaknesses are part of experimenting and you can't just say, oh, Vallejo sucks or,
or GW.
Or GW paints are terrible. I have probably 450 different individual paint pots that I've accumulated over 7 years. 8 years since I've been back in the hobby. And they're from every line of paint you've ever heard of. I have a couple pots here, a couple pots there, or, I don't use a ton of GW paints, but there are ones that I cannot live without. Besides non-oil and Agrax, So it's part of, like you said, if it's working for you, then use that. If you find yourself plateauing and you're not really improving, you're not really getting the results that you want, then, sure, try new things, try different techniques, find somebody that who's painting you admire and shoot them questions and try and figure out how they do things. But there aren't many silver bullets in this hobby. No. There's not really a silver bullet.
There's no
that's
next great thing.
You a better player.
No, there's not.
There's no real, just buying an airbrush is not going to make you a good painter.
Yep. It's like using the net list isn't going to make you a better player. There's just so many things that people look for that. They want, there's things that make your life easier, but there's no silver bullet.
But there's no silver bullet, and it just comes down to practice. Yeah. And it just comes down to repetition. And it comes down to wanting to be better. Yeah. If you don't really care about brush control, then don't worry about brush control. Yeah. So like you said, if there are products that work for you, use them, but if they're not really working, then be open to trying something else that might work better. Yeah. And don't just, there is no paint that you're going to buy that you're going to spray on your model and it's going to base coat, wash, highlight, and edge highlight your model for you.
It's not going to do the work.
It's not, there's no silver bullet. There's not one paint range out there. I'm going to buy all these paints and that's going to make me a better painter.
Yep.
It just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I'm always skeptical when I see these, miracle cures or, oh, wow, this is the best shortcut ever invented. Yep. And okay, but what are the results?
Yep.
Where do you go from there?
Yeah.
How do you incorporate that into your toolbox versus all of a sudden, hey, this is my toolbox now? That I think is flawed.
Yeah.
So acquire new tools, but get a good toolbox to work with.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I think that is, let's take a break and let's hear from our sponsor, TraderA.com.
Trader A.
If you're like most Warhammer players, you own a ton of models. At one time, you had big plans for these models, but now they just kind of sit, gathering dust, unused and unloved. It's time to clean out your closet of shame. Visit TraderA.com and get cash for your used models. Trader A is run by Captain A, someone who's been in the community a long time and has done a lot to grow the hobby. He's also a personal friend of the show. Unopened boxes, models on a sprue, half-built models, primed, painted, even bits have value. The process is simple. Send him a list of what you have. He'll send you a quote. You pack it up, send in your stuff, and he'll get you cash. You can shop around, but you're going to find that Trader A gives you 40% more than the other guys. You want it quick? You want to get rid of it? Visit TraderA.com. Get cash to buy the stuff that you really want. TraderA.com. Sell your models and get your cash quick and easy. All right, so we're back, and that is this is a jam-packed episode on miniature painting. So this is I think hopefully the basics from we started with painting, then we went to primer, then we went to varnish, and then a little bit back to painting. But I think that we have hopefully provided you a lot of things to think about when you start your painting project. And I think just like the airbrush episode, there's no silver bullets. That's basically the. No matter what somebody's trying to sell you and what they think is going to be better, and they're singing the praises of XYZ, it never works perfectly. That's okay.
No.
Try it out if you like, but always try to find what works for you, and it's always just about practice.
Practice.
That's just what it is.
Practice. That's how you get to Carnegie Hall.
That's how you get there. All right, so thanks for listening to the show. We love to hear from our listeners, so please feel free to message us on Facebook or email us at thebattlehosts@gmail.com. If you'd like to support us, you can help us in a few different ways. You can tell your friends about us and like us on Facebook. You can leave a review on iTunes, which does help to boost our listening audience. Finally, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thebattlehosts. So, thanks for listening to Battlehosts. Remember to be a better gamer.
And build a better community.
Good night.